This morning was very interesting. Looking at the worksheets and seeing what people have done. You know, what we were trying to do is just test, is there a way that people can really capture the essence of the physical characteristics of a community and think about how buildings might represent the community, and then how buildings might fit in, and thinking about, does context make a difference? Does setting make a difference in terms of how we feel about buildings and design or not? And what is it that makes it fit in? And we have heard certainly some differing viewpoints, and that's good. Diversity was one of the big words, and we'll put the word cloud back up later on. But diversity in people's experiences and values and the resources they bring to the table, as well as diversity in the built environment, are clearly parts of Missoula. No question of it. We'd like to continue just a little bit more with pursuing the idea of how does context influence our thinking about infill and new development of different sorts in the community. We had sort of framed some real rough kinds of categories, you know, downtown corridors, neighborhoods, just to sort of give some structure to your thinking this morning. What we thought would be interesting to do now, and this is a little bit freewheeling, is to working on a map which encompasses most of, but not quite all of Missoula. We struggled with finding a scale that you could actually see where you were on an aerial, and try to include as much of the city as we could. When we zoomed back to get the entire city boundaries, it kind of got too blurry to really be understandable. So if there's an important area that's cut off the map, it wasn't a intentional decision. It was just purely a graphic constraint. But again, this is not a definitive actual planning process. This is testing the waters and seeing what the temperature is and what kinds of tools might a community use to have this kind of conversation about design. So what we thought is that it would be interesting if you were to define 3 character areas. Just pick 3 spots that you would want to draw a rough bubble around. Doesn't have to be hard line. Oh, and you guys are missing a map? They don't get to play? Oh, come on, Heidi's going to be very upset. So the idea is to pick 3 areas. Now that could be a city block, or it could be a corridor. It could be however you as a group want to discuss it. It could be one of each of the categories that we already had introduced, perhaps downtown, a corridor, a neighborhood. You might say, we're really just interested, or we really want to test the differences in residential neighborhoods and only focus on some of those, or only on corridors and define what's different about one corridor than the other. So the first step is to sort of say, how are we as a table going to identify 3 character areas? What do we want to do about that? So that's going to be a little bit of a debate probably. But again, this is just to sort of figure out how can we begin to describe geographically different contexts that are important to us, or that have a distinct character, or in any way helps inform this conversation about context. So talk about that for a bit, decide exactly what your theme or approach is going to be, and then work to identify those 3 areas. And so you can doodle with some light pens, and then you get some heavier pens going till you finally identify those 3 areas. And then you can use Post-its to add any information, any descriptors about them that are things that define those areas in your mind. So that's the activity we're going to do here. And then after that, we'll kind of step back and look at all of this and sort of say, what does it mean? And then we'll start talking strategy about what do you feel we should report to the powers that be in terms of any next steps or anything like that. So we'll have a real roll up our sleeves session after we finish this last little bit. So areas of character that are important to you, or that to you are a high priority for discussion, or that in some way capture something important. Does that make sense? So give yourselves 10 to 15 minutes to sort of just figure out what's our approach here. What is it we want to try to map out on our table? And then move into actually defining some of those boundaries. Any questions? You don't have to do any cutting this time. Okay, get started then. Okay, if you will pin up your maps. And Brad, have you provided them pins? Okay. Just find a wall space any place. We're really filling up the room here. There's some walls back here, back toward the projection side, and back to the rear, a little bit over here in this corner. If you want to stay near your group, that's fine. You can pin under it. That's fine. Yeah, go ahead and pin over those sheets. We'll clean those up later.
Oh yeah, those were all pictures of places that weren't in Missoula. Yeah, that are not Missoula.
Some of them.
Like those were change oriented.
Oh, and what we forgot to do is ask you to write your. Oh, Brad's on top of it. Okay, all right. So, where are we going to start this time? Are you guys ready over here to give us a synopsis on what your rules were and what you came up with?
Knocking chairs over. So we came up with our 3 areas. We're looking around and we're like envying other people's bubbles, but bubble envy, yeah. One of ours, we started the conversation by talking about that there's kind of multiple reasons for doing this, and some might be preservation of a character and other might be encouraging change of the current character. And so we kind of focused on places that we saw room for improvement, and as opposed to preservation of existing conditions. And so one of those is Brooks from Miller Creek to Mount, with a few blocks on either side, because we think that's ripe for redevelopment, and we know of projects that are coming forward and things like that. Another is West Broadway from Orange to Mullen, and that is a transition out of downtown. It's even part of the downtown master plan. The boundary extends that far, and so there are, but yet it's still not quite downtown. So we separated that and identified that as a place. And then we have a reserve corridor that's divided into an A, a B, and a C. And we thought of that. We didn't think we were cheating. We still think we only have 3. But we did acknowledge that there are some differences. We call this the hotel district, this the box store district, and this is a kind of strip mall and also a rural-urban interface between. There's some working farms out there and still some open land that's developed. Some kind of green fields that have development potential. But we did see that they also all form part of a whole, in that they're entryways to town, and that they help frame the character of Missoula for people that are visiting or arriving, whether you're coming from the airport or driving up from the Bitterroot or driving in on I-90 from the west, that there are ways that it's your first experience with Missoula. And so it's kind of important to shape the character of those.
Okay, great. Excellent. Moving on.
Okay, we had something similar. We did downtown, including the Hip Strip, Broadway, and the Brook Street corridor. We also talked about corridors in general. So some of the things, of course, for downtown, it's preservation and protection, but also all three areas we identified a need for increased residential, and that will help with the vibrancy. We also talked about some missing sort of retail from downtown, like grocery stores, and it's sort of a chicken and egg thing. You need people to buy groceries before you're going to have a grocery store, but people won't move there if there's no grocery store. So, yeah, and we also talked about the corridors had similar, a lot of similar things, connections, walkability, parking challenges, fixed route transit, especially on Brooks, and more residential. And for this quarter, we identified one important missing piece, and it's not necessarily, a design objective, but we've done a really good job on the south side of the river, but we haven't really done our work on the north side of the river in terms of cleaning up that area and orienting towards the river. So helping West Broadway to orient itself towards the river and connect to the river was important to us. Is that everything, guys? Okay.
Okay, great. Next, who's ready to report? Pass it on. Go.
So I think we were looking at our distinctive character areas are the downtown, and that extends south of the river through the Hip Strip and includes part of, the university neighborhood and district. And then the west side, north side district being a distinctive character area. And then post-World War II era development along the Brooks Street corridor was our third area that we identified. And I don't know that we had any specific rules on what we were trying to do other than just what were the influences happening and potential change that could occur in those areas, good or bad. The downtown, the connectivity to the university and the influx of more students will probably lead to some sort of change in the character. The alterations to the Southgate Mall and to the fairgrounds could have an influence on what happens in that area. And then the urban renewal district and a lot of people moving to the north side could influence the character in that area.
Okay, great.
else?
Moving on.
Table 4 took into consideration current geography, whether or not to focus on preservation versus potential, economics, visual, culturals, and residential realities. And the three characters that we chose to identify include entry points, the three I-90 exchanges, Reserve and Broadway. We decided to identify Missoula College as the eastern edge entry point on Broadway, and Brooks and Miller Creek. In addition, we identified the river itself, both rural and urban, and we talked about preserving public access, orienting towards the river, and thinking about tendrils, those being trail systems funneling people to the river. The last character that we chose was downtown, like many others. Thank you.
Excellent. Very different take. Very interesting. Okay. Yes. All right. Where are we? 6, and then you guys right. Go with it. Yeah.
All right, you guys already stole all of our ideas, but we felt like there was, I think the river is a common theme, that we think the river is really underutilized and is a real strong asset in the community. So we looked at East Missoula, East Broadway, around the college as a gateway, kind of a first impression as you come into Missoula through the canyon. It's one of the first things you see. So as those buildings develop around the college, it's important that they have
a strong character. And then West Broadway, we think there's a lot of opportunities. It's one of these places that has that post-World War II development that is going to transition and redevelop. Maybe an opportunity for additional river access, the idea of a city park or a city beach that could be on the river. And then we extended that down the Russell Street corridor to 3rd Street because that's also an area that as that street gets improved, I think the land will respond. And then we also chose the Brook Street corridor, including the fairgrounds. It's a place where we feel like there could be more density, and that added density would help, density of residential would help some of the commercial forms that we'd like to see happen with things like on-street buildings and walkable environments. Comment to, as this development is happening, it's happening right now on Brooks, we want to make sure that when redevelopment occurs that we get development right, that we don't just reinforce the pattern that's there today.
Okay, great.
That's it.
Any more? All right, okay. Table 5 is your chance to blow us away.
So some of the ideas have already been discussed, especially what you guys did over there and this one too. We focused on corridors, and we feel like those are areas that are really dynamic and are changing a lot and also could possibly use a lot of improvement. So, and also they have the feature of being a gateway each time to the city, and so they give an impression when people are coming in, and tourists and visitors will get a sense of us from that. So we thought that the Brook Street corridor, well, all of these areas could use some traffic calming, but especially Reserve and Brooks, and multimodal options, and also especially along Brooks, mixed use here to create more of a neighborhood feeling and less of a busy thoroughfare. This area on Reserve, the lower part of Reserve, South Reserve, has really interesting quality, as people were mentioning, being this transition to city to county, and also farmland and residential from commercial. And so we'd like to see that have a very smooth, graceful transition, and not, so to make it more neighborhood-like, perhaps a little bit neighborhood-friendly, and safe for pedestrians. So, and then this last one, just to think about this corridor going all the way out to the airport and the connection it has to when people come into town from that direction.
Okay,
So that's
great.
it.
All right. Now it's time for us to. We've got an hour to really just sort. Oh! Then again. Sorry. No, they were doing. Yeah. This is very
We're just hiding over in the corner here. So I think a lot of what we have, other people have highlighted, so I won't go into too much detail, but we did have the north side, west side as sort of a historic, higher density, more, workforce kind of housing, or it was traditionally, railroad worker housing, and so there's a lot of opportunity there to increase that density and maybe have some opportunity to add in mixed use, or have some design recommendations that you could trade off density bonuses for design features that help integrate that density better into the neighborhood, especially with access to downtown and some of the other services. Then we highlighted the hip strip part of Higgins, as kind of talked about how it's sort of part of downtown, but it's very distinct when you get across the bridge. It's a very different feel in some ways on the hip strip. And it highlights a lot of what we've talked about as being good about walkable corridors or that mixed use, but it also highlights some of the challenges, like parking in that neighborhood is really contentious. So something to think about as we design other neighborhoods, that creating some of those corridors that we really like can create other problems if you don't have adequate facilities. And then we had the Brooks corridor, like everyone else, for the same reasons, the redevelopment opportunity, the surrounding neighborhoods, and opportunity to provide services there. But again, it highlights the pedestrian and other facilities there are really subpar. So you could build all of the mixed use you want, but if you still have really subpar sidewalks and other facilities, it's going to be hard to make that a really encouraging walking corridor. So there's some real challenges there with the Brook Street roadway and getting that design right to support the development that you want to happen there.
Wow. All right, so any big observations, themes coming out of any of this? Yes, sir.
What I really liked about the conversation here with this group was to turn like the river corridor idea or the interstate as a positive response. That's something you want to support in a certain way instead of a restrictive or regulatory or anti-negative response that often happens when things are broken. So that, I think, was very sort of insightful, that you set people up for a positive response to these characters rather than a negative kind of reactive response.
Good observation. Right. Yes.
Seemingly we're moving a little bit away from the architectural standards that we started off talking about, and we're all trying to kind of focusing on interaction with public space, whether it's the roadway or the river, but we're talking about integration and planning and mixed uses as opposed to design.
Okay. Anyone else real quick? Yeah.
One of the observations I had is that you can kind of look at the valley from three important areas that I initially recognized with, you've got the river corridor, you've got the hillsides, and you've got the valley floor. And then it's interesting how the valley floor then, the river corridor, one of those natural topographic features became a common theme. But then on the valley floor, there's a number of different areas that need attention for various reasons.
Yes, good. Okay, here are some of my quick observations coming out of just this, but also just top of mind from all day today, but some themes. One is this interaction between planning and design. Some of the things that you were talking about, particularly in the mapping exercise, was stepping beyond design, but that underscores a couple of things, that there is an interaction with the public realm, infrastructure improvements, and stimulating private investment. And that's often the case in form-based codes. That's an integrated understanding that often you have to look at the design of the street to help stimulate the investment in the private property. The other part about that is anticipating the kinds of uses and development that will occur could inform, if you wanted to provide design guidance, whether it's regulatory or advisory or whatnot, anticipating that increasing density and having more housing of a different product means we need to think about what kind of advice to provide about those things. So there is also an interaction there. So that was another theme, was intuitively a certain degree of increased density, whether it's downtown or along corridors or whatever, accommodating more use, more people. But also a real diversity in design, but a certain underlying theme of being respectful in terms of the images that you chose. Although it's fun walking around, there's a pretty wide range of what people chose in Activity 4 about fitting in. So there's an interesting message that there ain't the Missoula style that we can rubber stamp and say that's it. The connection with nature and buildings and properties and site designs that let us see views, that let us see the hills, that have green to them, that orient to the river, those are all things that seem to speak of Missoula in the way you've described things. Neighborhood services was interesting, intuitively thinking about building designs that would house uses that maybe aren't there right now that serve neighborhoods. That's an interesting piece of information. Supporting alternative modes, thinking about how in designing a site we provide connectivity that I can walk from a neighborhood up through that commercial development to the bus stop that is located on the site in an inviting way. It's not just an afterthought on the curb. That was something that rang in my ear this morning. Certainly more housing, and lots of discussion about opportunity. There was opportunity here in this corridor, opportunity in this location for change, for investment, whatever. And change being a real theme. Not hearing a lot about we're frozen in time. by any means. Certainly, that discussion may shift a little bit in terms of historic neighborhoods, but even there, I think what we've heard is that that's an area of where appropriate change would be desirable. And then that there maybe are some fundamental features that define Missoula, and maybe we haven't totally captured them yet today. This is a quick run, but it sort of, to me, does demonstrate that there is a way of beginning to capture some of those physical attributes that are valued. So that's my quick 2-minute report. What do you think? Is that, do I get an A or? Okay, and there's lots more, but I mean, as a quick walk around the room, that's what I get. Okay, so then that leads to, I want to hear quickly about this, and then we're going to get into what do you want to do next. But so going back, is design important to community character here? Do we care about this? Okay, all right. I'm not going to ask for the no vote. Is it possible to define community character after having gone through the, was that hand up for something special?
Before we move on, I wanted to just throw it out there that I do think there are some things that need to be done citywide and that aren't just for one particular corridor or one. I mean, there's some basic bad design that's happening all over the city, corporate architecture that I don't, so we focused on specific areas, but I don't want to say that we, unless people disagree, that we shouldn't do certain basic.
Well, and good point. This exercise was not to imply setting priorities for a next step. It was really about, can you define physical areas that have character or that you anticipate change occurring in? But it is true. As we move into implementation, we can go back to, can we do it citywide? Do we do it by certain zone districts? Do we do it geographically? There are all those different approaches to it. So, but just before we do that, but is it possible to define community character? I think you kind of began it here. You began to get at it a little bit. Would you all kind of agree? Yeah?
I think if we break it down into subgroups, it gets a whole lot easier.
Yes.
Nail it and said there ain't no Missoula style.
Right.
But if you talk to somebody in the McCormick district versus somebody in the South Hills, you do have different character, which I think you can't quantify, and character between residential and commercial. So depending on how you want to break it out, I think you can do quite a bit to define.
So context does make a difference for some of this. Yes. Okay. That can still be addressed citywide, but context does make a difference. And so then the next two questions are ones that we will work on here in a little bit more structure. But one is, what are the best tools to consider in promoting design excellence? Do we want to talk about a form-based code in some manner, or design guidelines? And if so, in a regulatory sense, or in an advisory or incentive-based sense, or some or all of the above? I talked about that spectrum of the way these tools could be applied. And I know that there are differences of opinion in the room, and this group isn't going to necessarily make that as their final decision, but I think it'd be interesting now to have a little bit of discussion about that. After having seen what people are thinking in terms of what makes Missoula, Missoula, what defines its character, what might fit in, how context changes what might fit in. Given all of that information, what do we want to do? What do you think ought to be the next step? Anyone? Yes, sir.
I'd like to make the case to consider design to be much more than a visual approach. These people are designing policies, they're designing multiple things, and it's not just a visual aspect. And so when you talk about character, it doesn't mean the visual character, or we have to be clear if that's what you're talking about, because character can mean a lot of things other than just how it looks.
Okay, so that's a fundamental question to be answered. When we're talking about design, are we talking about visual character? Yes, but also at least physical functional character. And I mean, there's socioeconomic, cultural value kinds of things that you could bring in too. But I think we already talked a little bit about circulation and access and connectivity and things like that that maybe are visual in design, but they also are physical site plan kinds of ideas. Yes?
I think there's a difference between certain neighborhoods that have historic characteristics or are designated historic areas where there's a very strong reason to have standards versus the Reserve Street corridor, which the whole EC zoning district was created to try to temper those big box stores. But I think recognize the difference in the character between those that are truly part of what makes Missoula Missoula, like the historic districts, versus what makes Missoula like any place else, which is those large stores that, so there's different standards for different.
Different standards for different areas. Okay, yes.
I would go back to, I think it touches on what Emily was discussing. I think that while standards and guidelines are two different things, carrot and stick, MRA already has the carrot. I do believe Missoula needs standards for a baseline because those box stores won't do anything different unless there's teeth, even if there's money available. So I do think I do think there are standards that need to be citywide.
That's interesting. We were once in a work session with one of the lead corporate architect for Target stores. And he said, if you don't design for us, we'll design for you. Yeah.
I'm a developer. Standards are okay.
Yeah, as long as they're clear, fair, predictable.
It seems to me that the danger often with that stuff is when you try to write it down, you're aiming at preventing the worst case, which then affects all the other cases. Somebody who might do something really nice and really creative can't, because we've written something to prevent the thing.
So part of the tone back here was to focus on the positive. What do we want? What are the solutions we want to support those? Certainly in some cases you want to say what we don't want, but if you only say that, all you're doing is filtering out that. Yeah. So focus on the positive.
And what you're talking about really shows the need for us to have a really robust, easy process for getting a variance. If you meet the spirit of the code, but you don't meet the letter of it, so that you can appeal quickly and have some kind of architectural review board that says, yep, you clearly met the spirit of this code. So I think it's important to make sure we have some kind of review that's easy for developers.
So to be robust, but to have some form of flexibility in it, and for easy and quick. Did I hear?
Yeah. So I do want. I don't know, but I get nervous when I hear about it being, when I hear about flexibility too much. I get nervous because that means that staff is the interpreter, and that the
Yeah, not necessarily. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So I think it's more important to have some kind of board.
That's fine. Yep. That's fine. No, okay. So, but I mean, it's still flexible. It's a question of who's making the decision at that point. That it shifts beyond an administrative, as we would say, review, and there's some form of committee. Right, and there are different flavors of that, just to follow up on that, and then we'll get you. But in the realm of flexibility within interpretation of code and guidelines these days, there are many communities that try to let the administrative staff make those decisions in the interest of being expeditious and quick. On the one hand, that puts pressure on them that sometimes they're not that thrilled about having. And then that's where guidelines that can be in combination with a code can provide flexibility for the staff to interpret. And in some cases it's set up so there's a design advisory board that advises them, but it's still an administrative decision. But there are many, many others where there is a formal design review process with a design review board or committee that you go to. And that's either if you're seeking alternative compliance, or in some cases if it's set up as that is a part of the process, you're going to go through the code and the design review process, and that's it. So all of those are possibilities on the table to talk about. Yep.
That's to follow up, where I'd like to put in a plug for intent statements, so no matter whether it goes to an administrator or a board, I think it's damn near impossible to legislate good design, especially for every condition you're gonna come across. And so for whoever's making the decision and whoever's trying to use the guidelines or standards, whichever, it's so important to have kind of the Constitution versus the letter of the law that says, this is our intent.
Yes.
So that when you get into a gray zone or something that the standards don't quite cover, everybody can fall back on the intent, and there's still something that you can discuss. And it gives a little more reasonability and a little more breadth of options, so it doesn't shut down all the options.
And there's a terminology here that I didn't touch on before that is helpful to think about, because what I've been referring to in those cases is what I've called alternative compliance, which is that in those situations where it is regulated and you're required to meet a standard, the flexibility isn't letting you off the hook. It's saying you've got a different way of meeting that intent. That is different from a term that is often used, which is variance. And that should be considered as something totally different. A variance in conventional land use law is there's something constraining the use of that property, and you get off the hook from meeting a certain standard. It is smaller than the minimum lot size, but you have the right to develop it, and therefore you get a variance. Or there's something about the road access or the curb cut or something. You're so physically constrained that otherwise you cannot develop your property. And a board of variance is set up for that and not for design review. And so that's a real heads-up caution here. If you set up a design review situation, you never, ever want it to go to the Board of Variances. Sorry, guys, if some of you are on the Board of Variance, but it's just because that's not what they're really set up for. Does that make sense? Okay, where are we? Over here. Yep.
Just on the design review board, I would make sure it's made up of professionals, i.e. architects. And I agree, it needs to be robust. It has to be done in a timely fashion. You can't get pushed out 60 days because in Montana we have certain windows to begin construction. And so it has to be like within 30 days to
when you want to get down to that administrative level of design review boards, there are a variety of techniques for expedited review. Some communities will have a formal design review board, but they'll have a subcommittee that's available to meet every week at 8 o'clock in the morning on Wednesdays. And so all you need to do is be on that docket. They report their decisions to the formal board, and it's done. So there are ways of expediting that, because that's always a concern that it not add extra time in the loop. Yep. And then I know there was, I'm sorry. Let me, you've had your hand up first, yes. Go ahead.
I'm concerned about the cost for the property owner to do the design board. That should be a consideration.
Cost of the design review process is a big issue. And you know, there's cost in terms of time, there's cost in terms of fees, there's cost in terms of paying for professional help. And at the scale of development, it's important that that be as low cost as possible. No, I'm sorry, yes sir, go ahead.
Yeah, Missoula used to be known as the Garden City. And the thing that I'm asking myself in a way is, would any of this have protected that identity? Because now it's obviously not a garden city. All the gardens are gone, the orchards are gone, all of that's gone. But that was the identity for the city for a long time. And people were sort of proud of that. It had a certain image. So if you do have an image, a larger image, that sort of transcends all these particulars and policies, how does this process actually protect it?
I'm trying to capture what you said. Just enough that I remember what you said. It's not very well captured, but an interesting point. And I guess part of the question is, if you could define those fundamental characteristics now, those would be the ones you focus on, and you wouldn't worry, because the other implication is valid, that change did occur. I mean, for whatever reasons, the economy changed. I mean, you couldn't require everyone to keep orchards if the orchards didn't produce anymore or make money, right? Or whatever it is that caused them to change. So we had to think about what is it that's more fundamental and how does that image translator change. If, in fact, that were part of that connection with nature and open space, there would be new contemporary ways to interpret that that's not orchards. But I know there's more of your point there, but it's something that's interesting to think about. Yeah?
In a state that seemingly consistently sides with the land and property owner over a municipality, how do we regulate design without opening ourselves up to lawsuits?
Well, I mean, you do need to stay within the parameters of state law, but there certainly are communities who have design review systems well established. Bozeman is an example. You know, they somehow have managed to keep those systems in place. There are certain things you want to be careful about in terms of not overreaching, both in the legislation itself and in the way a system is operated. Certainly form-based standards, code is reasonably easy to defend. But design review has been a part of the operation in Bozeman for quite some time.
Building, a lot of businesses are moving to Belgrade.
Is that what?
Is that why a lot of businesses are relocating or new businesses are going in Belgrade?
I don't know.
Bozeman?
Do you think it is?
I've heard that from several people
I
in
would say
Gallup.
it's more their impact fees is what's causing people to go out and county.
Impact fees.
Not the design.
Not the design.
What about land costs?
And land costs.
Yeah.
Land cost to build space, and being from Belgrade, and my dad developed in the area. It's a mixed bag of, there's a lot of people moving in, land cost, design standards, and just room over there. So that's it's not a direct result of the design standards, but partially.
But we
Yeah.
do want to be careful not, I mean, gentrification is definitely a threat for us here, and the working people in Bozeman live in Belgrade. And, I mean, it's hard to buy a house in Bozeman if you're middle class. I don't want Missoula to be like that.
So the impact on cost is a huge consideration. Some of what we've talked about is not so much cost as it is basic building placement and orientation. And but it is important also to note that a lot of the images, et cetera, that you've talked about do have higher quality materials, a higher level of detail. There is an expectation shown here about higher quality building than some of the more recent structures.
Yep. I think two things. One is that if there was a way to incentivize, so if there was an expedited review or there was some way to encourage people to do things, encourage developers to do things that would conform to certain standards, that would be a good way to go. But also that those standards, I mean, we're not like Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's like, I think we need to recognize that those standards should be flexible enough to have a creative architect be able to do something that fits it, but in an unexpected way, that maybe people wouldn't have, that maybe doesn't fit everybody's idea of good design, but challenges people to maybe think of what good design is. So not make it overly restrictive.
And there was the first part of it that there was a little bit there about the Santa Fe and something. There was another point there that
Well, just that Santa Fe, because of the character, is so restrictive.
Right. Oh yeah. So I think there's a tone of focus on the essential. What are the critical things to character and excellence here, and stop at that. Don't fuss with things that are not. Okay.
That seems important to me too, because I feel a certain urgency to do this, that things are happening and we don't have 5 years to figure this out. We're missing opportunities. So focusing on what's really essential to get the critical elements we want in some kind of code.
Okay. The other thing about a lot of the unexpected and looking around, there was an intuitive recognition. We had put a few buildings in that were really very different in form. And intuitively, several teams selected those as institutional facilities. They sort of said this could be a library or a community center and whatnot. And in fact, most of them were. And well, that points out that we do expect civic buildings to stand out. We want them to be different and unexpected. You know, that's a part of their tradition and heritage. The courthouse doesn't look like a storefront. You know, so that's an important point. What else? Yes, ma'am.
I'm not quite sure how to articulate it, but I think there needs to be an inclusiveness in the way in which the community is included in this process. Because I was thinking, the Verizon store went in on Broadway close to Rattlesnake and downtown and University districts and was a total flashpoint. But years before that, a Verizon store went in on Reserve, and I don't think anybody said anything. So our neighborhoods have very distinct voices, and I think there needs to be buy-in from the community instead of impositions of design standards. So I'm not quite sure how that all plays out, but it is a value, I think, that needs to be addressed.
Oh, well, I think absolutely, yes. That is critical, and both from the social-political standpoint, also the physical standpoint. Intuitively, we've been saying there are differences in, you know, where we get upset or not based on context. So, yeah, yes, ma'am. And then you.
If I had one of my favorite wishes come true, it would be that each community had the opportunity to become educated in these issues that we've addressed today.
Okay.
So it's about bringing an understanding of design down to the street level. I think that's critical. It should be a conversation amongst every mayor and
yeah, the idea that it's a conversation. Okay, I like it. So a very informed discussion, open, community-based, and giving neighborhoods opportunities to speak as places. Yes, and yes, ma'am.
I agree with a lot of what everyone has said. I think that we do have a need for some standards while still having some flexibility. I also think that it would be nice to have some guidelines. One of the things that I've heard everybody say today, and I know that we value it, and on campus we just went through a similar process with the building that I work in, is people want open space and this idea of community and places to gather. And specifically with some campus developments relevant to student union buildings, there's a lot of conversation around sticky space, places designed for people to congregate, to gather, to have a sense of community, both internal to the building and external. And I think that it would be nice with some of these communities that are sort of developing or already have identities to also be able to have a conversation not just about the efficiency and the services that are going to be housed in the space, but also on the efficacy of the engagement that can be held within that space and outward.
Okay. That's great.
The only thing I don't think it's, I'm speaking from the developer's standpoint, I don't think we should be focused on the design on the internal part. It should be on the external. It should be up to the developer to figure out what the market's going to be.
No, I think they're the only areas in which I am aware of government getting involved in internal spaces is historic landmarking of some lobbies in public buildings that are frequented by the public. Otherwise, they're voluntarily landmarked, but otherwise, I'm not aware of these kinds of design guidelines or standards going inside the building. But the idea about the design of outdoor public gathering spaces came up earlier today, places for people to gather in a neighborhood, and thinking about how they're designed, I think is something to think about. There was a hand.
Well, I was just going to follow up on your comment about including the communities and the individual people as possible to make. I mean, we're all going through an educational process here, but for somebody who hasn't been part of the process, include some education in the guidelines or some ethics from the community. So if I come to Missoula, the process is done, there are guidelines, I can pick up a book and it says, oh, okay. Now, I may not be a trained architect, but now you can explain to me how important massing is, and now I know why you're legislating massing. Is there a way to make education part of basically the document?
And or of the system, yes. So user-friendly, what I would call handbook, to make it distinguish a little bit from any of the other things, which is more an educational, informative thing. Here are the principles of design that we value here in our community. Very good idea. Yes?
To speak to Jim's point, I totally agree that we're talking about the external and not the internal, but one of the things that I observed from a lot of our pictures that we put up of buildings that we like is they interact with people on the inside of the building and on the property they have opportunities to interact with people that are in the public right of way outside of that, whether it's a balcony or doorways and glazing and sitting in a coffee shop and looking at the people watching, or outdoor living spaces in the residential pictures. There is an interaction between the interior of the site and the exterior. But I'm also totally aware that developers have a much better handle on what the market, what people want to do with their private property.
Some of those may be, from the design review standpoint, secondary benefits of a form guideline that is doing something to reduce mass or provide visual interest or articulation in the building skin. A balcony, a roof deck, any of those things may make the form more interesting and in scale and happen to also be of great value to the project. Yes? Yeah.
I had to side with Jim a little bit as well, but I think that's where you can find the balance between what is the standard paired with incentive, because I think we both have developments with public right-of-ways in the middle of our developments with gardens and stuff on them. So, and that was incentivized and without standards. So I think you can do that nice balance.
But that's still outdoors, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, because I thought you were talking about literally inside the building. Yeah. Yep.
There are actually volumes and volumes in my office of codes and standards for inside buildings. So it's not that that's not highly regulated for all sorts of reasons. It deals with market, deals with safety, deals with a lot of things. But on the other hand, it's like a lot of this, I'm confused whether it's a means or an ends. Buildings for a lot of people, like developers, is a means towards wealth building. For other people, the building is an end. It's a home. It's a place to work. So it's like being clear. Who are these regulations serving? Who's the client? Who's the future generations? I mean, a lot of people are working on a very short time frame.
And of course, the answer is all of the above.
You hope. Yeah.
But being aware of that, and somewhere in the character management system, information that's available to the layman to introduce them to community design, information that's there for the developer and their architect and for the reviewer. There are many users when you're structuring these kinds of documents that you have to be aware of. Okay, where are we here? We're sort of discussing the question of, where to go? What are the best tools to consider? So I'm hearing several tools. We're not making the final decision today, of course. This is just to inform the conversation. But an argument for standards that might be applied in a variety of ways, and we'll zoom in on that a little bit in a minute maybe. Guidelines with potentially a design review process in some form. Educational advisory materials, incentive tools. All of those, I think there's an interest in the room in having a discussion to advance those tools. Is that right? What else in terms of what's our best, what are the best tools to consider here? Yes?
I'm a fan of overlay districts with design review boards.
Overlay districts with guidelines and boards, okay? Well, so we've got, let's see, let's fill that in a little bit. Well, I guess all right, so let's do that a little bit. Let's see, let's talk about design guidelines then. And their application. So, some have been advocating for overlays with a formal design review process. So that could be an historic district, it could be a neighborhood, it could be downtown, whatever, design overlay with guidelines. One option. Any other strong feelings about other ways to apply guidelines that need to be explored next? Or that's sort of the front runner? Yep.
Carrot and stick, I'd like to see some incentives built in as well.
Okay. Let's put that there. I'm surprised how well I'm doing with my spelling. Usually writing, standing up is hard. Okay. Yes, sir.
Education, I think, is an important piece of this at every level, so the guidelines make sense to people at all levels.
So to be certain that they are also educational, okay?
Yeah, and that populations, neighborhoods, kids, everybody gets a sense of what good design is and why you should follow guidelines or why you should develop them.
Okay. We'll put it in civics class. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Use pictures or easy guidelines so you don't need to hire a lawyer to represent you.
Okay. Illustrated. Easy to interpret. What else do we need to say about design guidelines today in terms of what we want to pursue next? Is this enough? Do we want to talk about any particular areas, or?
I just had noticed people mentioning there's some things that we feel are sort of precedent. So I don't know if I even agree with this idea, but I've noticed that it might be good to think about putting some guidelines or some code in place quickly and then taking a longer process for a lot.
Okay, all right. Let's hold that, right, because we're going to then go down a list of what do we think about form-based code or codes, and what do we want to consider for those, and yours is a macro point, which is within either of those there may be some first priority steps and then some other things. So let's come back and remind me about that one. But anything else just about guidelines in terms of where we want to explore those? Yes, Chris?
I think that in terms of the term overlays for the board, I think what my first flag that goes to my hand is 90 days, 160 days. So I think that there needs to be an administrative function that's built in there for, and that perhaps it's in the overlays, but there needs to be an administrative approval process that the design review board is in the field, in my opinion.
Okay, so, all right, so it's sort of administrative approval, but in your mind would be the default. I'll use the computer term these days. With a board option. So that's one vote, and we're not voting, but that again, if we're in any way helping to create the list of things to be certain are discussed in more detail, that would be one. Is because we've also heard the other argument, which is that the board, it is board directed. So there's some interface or question about whether it's a formal board or a board of an alternate discussion or not. In some
Concern time or function?
Well, I think it's time and efficiency. You know, there's an awful lot of projects out there that probably will be brought in that will be fine. And if every one of them has to go to a board, then I think you're looking at a time problem and an efficiency problem and a cost problem. So, and not necessarily for a great reason. So just a caution there. But at this point, I'm just envisioning this. You know, okay, we're going to go to this board for their sign, and this board for the zoning, and this board for this, and this board for that. And oh, and we're going to have MRA board because we're going to need help with all the other requirements of the other boards. And it just, I don't know. I just got this really scary thought.
No.
I think it's true. I mean, coming from Seattle, there was oftentimes we had projects that would go through months and months of design iterations just to get board approval from one board. So if you're talking like multiple boards and you have that potential hiccup, that could really delay a project for years.
It used to take me 2 years to get a zoning permit in Seattle for a mixed use.
Yeah. All right. So this structural question is a very important one, is what we're hearing. This really needs to be addressed in a very clear way. Yes?
Two things. The first one is community review. So I personally am opposed to an expedited review process. I think maybe one of the things we could do in order to maintain Missoula's cultural and historic heritage is to say, if you're going to come in here and develop ranch land, it's going to take you 2 years. Here it is. That's it. If you want to come in, bite the bullet and know that it's going to take 2 years to process. Second thing is qualifications of people on the review boards. What are those qualifications? Is it that you have to have a degree from Montana State School of Architecture and Engineering? Or are we going to open up that process to a greater extent so that more experts from outside of state can come in and offer their opinion? I'm opposed to people being on the design review board and their only qualifications are that they oversaw the K through 6 school cafeteria. All right, so that's my thought.
Well, qualifications of a board are a very important consideration. Some argue for a professional board. Many boards may require a percentage to be professionals in development and design fields and construction fields, but do provide some slots for John Q. Citizen to also be heard, and there's an ongoing debate about that as in terms of who gets to be represented on the board. There's another aspect of community review that ideally, often in response to something negative that has happened, people say, we want our neighborhood to be able to review every project. And that's a sign of fear, obviously. And the idea is that if you can create a set of standards and guidelines that everyone understands and that are predictable, the neighborhood is more comfortable about other people making those decisions more quickly and in an expedited process because they participated in developing the standards and the guidelines and setting up the system, as we've talked about earlier, about it being very open and transparent in the development of them, so that they have the trust to hand it over to those who then run it on a daily basis. And then you can build in checkpoints, annual reviews of the system, et cetera. But that's where the neighborhood reviews the reviewer, not the project. And that's the difference. You're looking at maintaining the system, and you're not dragging every property owner before a resident committee on individual projects. So that's also a part of the idea of an efficient system to be set up. All right, so the flip side is, all right, so there's some interest in pursuing design guidelines, questions about how can we make it efficient, how would we apply it, needs to be educational, et cetera, it needs to have incentives. These are all very, very good points to say that this would need to be looked at in detail. Same question now about form-based code, the more restrictive, codified standards related to building form, placement, et cetera. Do we want to pursue that discussion any farther? Yes, no, maybe. Yes, sir.
I think that the zoning that's in place there already is form-based code. The question is, how specific do those form-based codes get? Side yard setbacks, building heights, those are form-based codes.
Yes.
I think if it becomes too idiosyncratic, then it causes a lot of problems. And it goes back to the idea of keeping it broad. So when you say form-based codes, I guess I sort of wonder, to what degree are you carving that bill? And I think that's something to be cognizant of.
I think you're duplicating, like he says, we're duplicating something that's already there.
And use the existing regulations, like the Verizon building, is that really about lack of design standards, or is it about a sign ordinance that's not really doing the job?
Right.
So looking at, rather than inventing a whole new set of regulations, like look at our existing regulations and say, where could they be improved? You know?
Okay, so here we're talking about it's not new, it's perhaps refined, where something's not doing its job. All right, yes?
There's been a lot of growth, and there continues to be more growth. There's getting to be, there's neighborhoods, there's zones, and then there's getting to be sort of sub-areas. We talked about corridors and different things like that. So it's possible, I've seen a lot of different design guidelines for different cities, and what they do is they'll describe a particular area, and they'll talk about what they love about that area, what is the character of that area, what they want to encourage and what they want to discourage. And so they just kind of give, it's like pruning a tree a little bit, you know, it's still growing, but you give it a little bit of it's specific to these subzones. So maybe we don't change that many codes, but we narrow it down to specific sub-areas now, or whatever works. But
Well, then, so we're going to circle back to your point earlier, which is kind of leading up to, are there some priority areas that, or where there's a sense of urgency or not to move on to anything? But so form-based code is just, let's look at some of the specifics perhaps that we have and see if they're doing their job. Yep, what do you think?
So kind of agree, kind of don't agree, and I guess the ways I don't agree are that we might want to transform how buildings address a street. And the kinds of codes that we have right now allow you to, as long as you get within 20 feet, it's okay. But we might want to say you have to be within 20 feet. And so they're sort of turning things on their heads that are really quite a different attitude that might be worth considering in these corridors that we're all kind of identifying as areas that are in transition.
So there's a real question as to whether or not the existing code really addresses corridors adequately, even with the new tweaks. That would be something to test.
If we want a different kind of pedestrian realm, public realm, we have to mandate that our buildings behave in certain ways a lot more clearly than we are with the current code.
Okay, all right.
I'd kind of like to take wherever we're tweeting, wherever we're proposing new regulations, regulations, or standards. I think part of the education process for the community would be nice to say, okay, if we're in a residential area and we're proposing setbacks, massing, height, we're proposing numbers, it'd be nice to take some samplings to say, okay, in your neighborhood, you already have this range of numbers for height, massing, setbacks, whatever. That's why we're proposing a standard and I think we can extrapolate that to what Tom was talking about too. Here are the good examples in our neighborhood that we'd like to steer you towards. Here are the bad examples that we'd like to steer you away from on how the building addresses the street.
Okay, some things that we didn't spend much time on this morning that we see used and that we use often is, yes, an analysis of context, defining what some of those basic framework features are. In a residential neighborhood, it's easier to visualize it. What's the range of setbacks? Are they all uniform, or are they within a certain narrow range of limitation? What's the normal building height and scale and floor area ratio, et cetera? So that is data-driven today because of the beauty of GIS. So much more of that information is available rather quickly in terms of being able to analyze the character, as well as photo essays and walking tours and things. And then modeling, using 3D computer modeling to illustrate a block and what the typical development patterns are, and dropping in alternative development scenarios to sort of say, if you go 1.5 times the size of the house or 2 times the size of the traditional house, here's what it looks like. That helps make informed decisions.
It'd be nice up front to realize where context is starting to kind of drive standards. So if you have an existing context the neighborhood appreciates, but by the same token, it would be nice to kind of take the other parallel path and say, in what areas do you have a lot more freedom from context-driven standards.
And that'll change over 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. I mean,
It will.
those neighborhoods will be nothing, and then this one will be a lot. But you can't put a circle on that and say, right here.
But in which standards we develop, if you're looking at a historic residential area, that's an obvious kind of context-driven one. But if you're looking at redefining North Reserve Street, it would be nice to be more innovative about it and say, okay, context doesn't matter so much, but here's the quality we are looking for. And
Okay, so
set the philosophy right up front for whichever area or strategy you're taking.
Okay, well, so there are a couple things there. What is the role of context is an important fundamental question. And just because we've defined it doesn't mean it's got to stay that way, is your point. And there are some places where having it be stable and some planning now differentiate areas of change and areas of stability, trying to indicate that basic underlying policy decision about those places. The general assumption is our older established residential neighborhoods, our historic downtowns, et cetera, tend to be established contexts that we want to respect while accommodating compatible infill. The inverse is the corridors, which now, 50 years from now, we'll probably be bemoaning the fact that we changed all this strip commercial because we'll say, gee, that represented America in the 1950s. But for the moment, we're saying no. And there, it's not applying preservation principles or context sensitivity. It's trying to create a new context, establish a new one that's based on accepted best practices in urban design. This is placemaking, this is community building, this is creating a place that's more pedestrian-oriented, more multi-generational, more inclusive, a lot of other things that aren't about style, but they are about how you build a new kind of street. That said, even within an established neighborhood with very, very distinctive character, the community could have some very different policy stances. So I just do want to differentiate that physical character has to be combined with the planning policies for the community and for individual neighborhoods. That's just what we're doing in LA right now with the single-family residential zone. Just to give you an example, right now, a huge amount of the city is zoned R1. And that includes little houses on small lots to big estates. They've all got the same rules. And people are screaming all over the city because they're seeing incompatible houses in their neighborhoods. And they didn't know that you could build that big a house next door because no one ever did. But the zoning quietly was always permitting that to happen. So what we're doing now is saying, within the same neighborhood where we have a defined development pattern of a certain type, we're going to create 6 flavors. And I'm not suggesting that this solution here, but it's just the idea of combining physical character with policy. So this is an established single-family neighborhood uniformly in scale and uniform setbacks, et cetera. And in your neighborhood, you want it to stay that way, and you want the rules to be pretty restrictive in terms of the scale of new building and the character change. Your neighborhood sort of says, you know, we don't mind a fair amount of change as long as it's modulated and sculpted to fit in. It could be bigger, you know. And Karen says, you know, it's for us, we love it all. Bring it on, you know. Bring on the change. It's great. And so for the same neighborhood, there will be 6 different new zone categories that reflect those varying degrees of acceptance to change in character and form. So one will be really restrictive. The existing zone happens to be, I keep closing this thing and then I can't open it, but the existing zone tends to be one of the ones right in the middle. So some will be more permissive than the current zoning is, and some will be more restrictive than the current zoning is, and they will go through neighborhood planning processes to decide where they want to be. So, you know, right here is where most of them are. Only to make the point that it's a combination of the two. We're about running out of time, are we? We are. We're about running out of time. So anyway, anything more about what we've heard so far about form-based code stuff is maybe some application along corridors. Yes?
Oh, I was just going to say regarding form-based, it seems like when we're starting to talk about accepting a height, and we've been talking about transition to other neighborhoods, that the visual tools that you get from form-based can really help. And I saw your examples of scale and matching and step back and changing percentage so that we are addressing the street scale, and then accepting a greater height as it steps back. So that's where I see the visuals really being helpful, and that I see in the form-based example.
Okay.
Mostly, I think. And it seems like it's helpful for transition.
So, I mean, along corridors and dealing with those transitions, maybe there are some refinements, further discussion about form-based code that could be useful. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Can form-based codes kind of narrow down a color and texture palette, or is that outside of the parameters of form-based code?
Most often, that's outside the parameter. Most codes don't want to go that far. It's really hard to get down to that level. I mean, if you want to code neighborhood by neighborhood, maybe you could for people that would agree on that. But normally, that is more at a design review, design guidelines level, or at least a conservation district option, which might be a more restrictive overlay, but not a base zone, where there could be some of that mandated. In Los Angeles, for a conservation district system, we are saying there are about 3 or 4 additional design variables that you might be able to address. One could be building materials. If, in fact, you're in an area where there's a predominant palette that is very, very important, that could be mandated. Now, that gets tricky, and I know I can feel the architects in the room getting a little nervous about that, because the moment I say you got to have 40% brick, someone's got a 35% brick design that's terrific, or whatever. So that's why when it starts getting a little difficult to regulate, but it's sometimes in an overlay, yes.
Yeah, I heard LaValle say that she likes the visual aspect of the form-based codes that you were showing examples of earlier. Is that tool limited to form-based codes, or is that something that's integratable to?
Oh, they're in the guidelines as well. Yeah, no. The visualizations appear in both. I mean, I was showing you some of each all along the way, not necessarily always distinguishing one from the other. And in fact, in some projects that we've worked on where we're doing both simultaneously, some of those images are shared amongst the documents to even show the continuity of policy. Yes?
I'd be curious to know about the townhouse, and not the townhome thing that's being debated, but the townhouse standards in the zoning ordinance. That's to me is kind of beginning to look like a form-based code. It says where you can have your garage, where you can have your entrance, and it's pretty specific. Does that, and I haven't used it, and I'm curious if the architects have used it, or if it's something that is in the zoning ordinance that is kind of what we're talking about here, but it's so restrictive that it's kind of like, I don't know, I'd rather do a PUD or something. I mean, because that's kind of what we're talking about, is having very specific standards that apply across the board.
I think we will need more discussions about what the differences are here and such as we start maybe studying a particular area. But when I think of form-based, I think it's not linked to the uses. It's like it's less about the uses, and that's a townhome. The townhome use, and those are visuals on how the regs look.
Right, but
this
where
is
you
the regulation. This is an example of what that looks like.
Right.
But the form-based also gives you the opportunity to look at more along the lines of modeling, I think, and options.
and form. So you see that form looks like this, and it can relate to the next building, the one next to it. So you get patterns setting up, and you get setbacks setting up. But it also gives you like a palette of a few different tools to work with. If you don't step back, what it would do, what would be the requirement if you didn't do that. So I think that it's a little more rich, a little more robust.
Okay. All right. So Karen had asked earlier about sort of, or was beginning to lead us toward priorities, and our even though a lot of what we're talking about here is a well-paced, comfortably paced, community-engaging conversation to reach some consensus and to define some areas to address. But that said, there was the question of, are there some areas of urgency or concern, a time of opportunity that are there places we want to give high priority to, or do we take it all at one kind of pace? Yep.
One of the things that hasn't been discussed that wasn't part of the form-based code is things like sustainability and other things. Form-based codes have been computerized for a long time now, and you can generate combinations and permutations. And now it's possible to begin to add in orientation and that, so you get solar aspects and that sort of thing. So it seems like the form-based code is the big thing. It doesn't take a lot of judgment, because it's all been computerized, and you can generate all of that. But it's the rest of the things that you're looking at, like view and energy use and all these other things that the form-based codes don't take into account.
That's right. Many of them have not. I think it's a very valid point that considering some of those other tools in concert would be good. What you may be referring to is there are some form-based codes that are pretty formulaic, and they were written for sort of basically what would normally consider green fields, and that is undeveloped areas that are going to be a new neighborhood or whatnot. When you start trying to retrofit a form-based code into an existing established community, that's where context becomes so much more important. That's why a part of this conversation today, I think, is so essential. Because we've had to come in some cases, retrofit and adjust some of those formulas to be more context sensitive. So that's one part of your comment. The other part is to incorporate sustainability into the standards in a variety of ways. And I touched on low impact development standards, which have to do with retaining stormwater and that aspect, but solar access is another one. And so, for example, a few years ago in Boulder, when we were working on residential design standards, Boulder has a solar access ordinance, which is another layer that helps shape form. And you have to take that in consideration, because if you were to drop a conventional form-based code in, those buildings wouldn't fit, because they're all asked to lean one direction in terms of shading and solar access, whereas a lot of the form-based codes assume symmetry on a site. And that isn't necessarily what you would get if you start to include sustainability and particularly solar access into the equation. So if that's important, at least maybe it is a good topic to take farther, because it's one that does require a different level of discussion if you're going to start talking about that. Any other priorities that we want to report out of today? We'll be writing up a memo to the city about what all of this said today and what you've recommended be next steps. So this is your opportunity to give me some words. Yep.
This is more of a question back to you. You do this in hundreds of communities around the country, and I guess I'm interested to hear if it ever isn't a good idea to implement design review or form-based codes. And I guess the reason I ask it is that we're an incredibly engaged community. People are very interested in the success of Missoula. But I would say that we're not as far along in reviewing and thinking about design issues. The number of buildings that really rise to public discourse is, what, a half dozen in the last 10 years, maybe? So are we ready for it? And can we fail if we do it?
Yeah, you can fail. Short answer. Well, yeah, lots of questions there. Are you ready for it? Well, what is it? I think you're ready for the next level of discussion, I think. But what is it going to be? I'm not sure there's a clear picture about that yet. I think there's a clear interest in pursuing this to another level of information. And I think what we've always tried to do is help communities make informed decisions about setting up these kinds of systems. Can you jump too far? Yes, you can, and generally the political process will snap you back. We experienced a couple of those. There was, I won't name the community, but they're far, far away from here, and the process was focused on creating design guidelines for one particular area. And the city council said, these are so great, let's adopt them citywide. Boom! The public process had not been the intent. That had never been the discussion. And man, the place got kind of excited. And rightfully so. So, I mean, yeah, you can overreach, you can overstep. And that's why I think you want it to be informed and people to understand and to answer all of these concerns about it not turning into something that's out of control and that's not doing what you want to do. So several of them we've built in a check at the end of the year and a report on how's it working, building in some of those kind of safeguards for that very reason. So. Fail, I'm not sure, but it can have unintended consequences. And in other cases, it can fall short of your expectations. It may not achieve everything you think. Promoting high quality materials is different from requiring high quality materials. That's over an edge. That's a little bit difficult. You can talk about providing depth of detail, about using durable materials that are proven in this climate so that it's not something that's going to fall apart in 5 years. But that's different from saying you got to use, turn metal roofing or whatever. So, yeah.
So I've heard a couple times people speak to gentrification and fear of gentrification and how having it out of control. What I see is a lot of things that may add cost to development, potentially, and the notion of incentives. And I think what also comes with gentrification is a reduced affordability for getting in as a homeowner or even as a renter. So I think affordability, and if this is in response to gentrification, I think affordability of a place to live is a key piece of that whole discussion that shouldn't be left out.
Which is driven by economics, not design generally.
Right, the restrictive standards add cost to design. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, a couple of sides to that. One is be certain you're not asking for things that really make no sense, that add costs and don't add value to the property for the developer, whether it's affordable housing or market rate housing. And we've certainly heard some more stories of things that perhaps were well intended, but the intent statement ain't there. And if you were to see the intent, you'd say, I've got a much better way of meeting that objective than what that requirement has in it.
So if they can prove that they're creating opportunities for affordable housing, then maybe that should expedite review or somehow that could
Sure.
be part of the process.
Absolutely, it could be. And or it's, or you get added density, or I mean, there are any number of things that can be incentives for affordability and still meet the design standards. Yep. Have we? Yeah, a couple more hands. Let's keep going.
There's the regulatory affordability for staff, and when you have so much staff capacity, there's a cost to that. So you can either decrease the quantity that you're reviewing, or decrease the quality, or increase your cost. One of those has to change if you're having more reviews. So that's something that should be considered as we adopt more code. Is there staff capacity, and if there isn't, how that can be added through either increased fees or whatever that might
That does argue for any standards that are easy to administer that don't actually add time and cost at the administrative side. There was another hand, I think. Yes.
It's kind of in a different direction, but you mentioned conservation districts. And I was curious to see if you had any examples off the top of your head where those are successful.
Well, yeah, we have experience with them in several places around the country. A conservation district the term gets used in a pretty wide range. It is normally an established neighborhood that we want to maintain its general character, but we don't want to go so far as designating it as a historic district for any number of reasons. It could be that that community doesn't want that extra level of regulation that an historic district provides, because in design review of an historic district, preservation of the integrity of individual historic resources is a fundamental principle. And that can mean saving the porch and the details and the cornices and the jigsaw trim and the eaves, etc. And some neighborhoods will say that's not something, we don't want you to go that far, but we do want to keep the basic form and character of our neighborhood. We want to be a bit more restrictive than the basic zoning standards are. And it mostly focuses on new construction and additions, mass and scale and materials and form of new construction. That means I could remove the porch, which I could not do in a historic district, but I could in a conservation district as long as the basic form is there, et cetera, or depending on what your standards are for the area, but that's generally how they work. We've just helped Pittsburgh set up a system for conservation districts, and we're writing guidelines for them in Mobile, Alabama right now. And so there's a kind of a negotiated process of what are we going to review. The other key part about a conservation district is demolition delay, because one of the biggest concerns about a conservation district is loss of existing building fabric. But since you're not in a historic district, and this is a legal mechanism to watch out for, and I ain't the attorney in the room, but generally you can't deny demolition of a building unless it is designated as an historic resource. And so for most of those situations, it's a delay to give the community time to react and respond to it. To say, oh, that building actually is of historic value, let's nominate it to become a landmark. Or let's find an alternative to demolition. Let's see if we can work with the owner or find a new owner who will take on that property. So it gives the community some time to respond above and beyond the normal demolition permit time. And that's one of the key features of a conservation district. So that said, I mean, some have design review, some just have added design standards. As I mentioned earlier, they might go to materials, whereas the underlying zoning would not, but within that conservation overlay. But it still could be administered at a staff level. Others involve a design review board, just like a preservation commission would. The one we're setting up in Pittsburgh is one for staff level review with a referral to the planning board if staff is not comfortable making the decision as an advisor. But it's to this point of keeping it as simple as possible to administer along the way. So that's a conservation district. So have we covered it all? You guys just absolutely worn out? Was this, do you think we've gotten enough direction here that we can kind of write this up a little bit? Yes, Laval.
I think if in your reporting, as Emily mentioned, we focused a lot on areas and the last half of the day. But let's continue to keep in mind that there might be some work that we need to do generally across our regulations, whether it be, the building a sign or talking about parking garages a bit more, or, some things that might be use-based across the board. So I think that's still out there, and how we handle that, how we prioritize that.
Well, and to Karen's question, those might be some of the things that can happen quicker, because the others take a lot of neighborhood conversation And it could be that some of those kinds of fixes, if you will, could be handled across the board by land use type or building type or something like that. So that's a good point. Yep.
What would be really helpful is to develop a glossary, because when people are talking about cost, I'm asking, is it life cycle costs they're talking about? Is it immediate costs they're talking about?
Yeah.
Is it short term? So there's a lot of terms been used here that you have to assume what somebody means about it.
Yeah.
And that's not helpful to get to common ground so you can talk about the same thing. So
That's a good point, because a lot of the cost implication discussion is really upfront cost, and that ain't necessarily the cost. Yes. Okay, well, I think we're going to adjourn. We're going to kind of clean up the place a little bit, and anyone who wants to hang around, we're going to have an open house here starting a little bit, which is for anyone else who wants to drop by, and any of you who want to stay around and help explain what was accomplished today. We'd appreciate it very much. I want to thank city staff for all of your hard work, Laval and Mike and everyone, for helping to really organize this. You did a lot. As well as Linda, I know she had to leave. She had a personal commitment and to Chris and the MRA for helping to pull this all together as well. Anyone else have a parting shot? Yep.
It's not a parting shot. I'm curious what the next steps are. You're going to draft up a report that will come back that says, hey, there's 65 actively engaged people that are all have interesting perspectives about this. So here's how they move forward, and then we follow that, or what happens?
Yes, I think this will be a topic of discussion for the Planning Commission and for City Council when we get that report forward. I don't know, Mike, if you have any other thoughts about how that will proceed or anything?
No, we take direction from City Council, so many council members have been here for all part of the day, so we'll be looking forward to that report and their response and some direction.
Well, thank you all very, very much. You've really been great.